Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Long Haul 2, Part 1, by Bear Lair. Makes no sense, Colonel Walters exclaimed. Trujillo's video shows a pretty routine stop. The audio's on. Wilson shows him to be contrite, even submissive, trying to avoid consequences. He got back in his truck and left. No signs of anger. Didn't even slam the door. The seal is still on the trailer. Not super clear, but definitely not broken. The technician looked up at his boss. Sir, it's clear enough in total. Wilson could not have acted at that point. Had he gotten to Trooper Trujillo later? Maybe circled back around? See what other footage we can get. State rest areas, parks, traffic cameras, en route security. Where's Captain Biles? We need his team on this. It's getting strange. No blood in the truck, unexplained recordings and timelines, no physical evidence with the patrol car. Hey man, that was like too close. The sun almost caught us. We should have turned back at that little town. Raisin was grouchy. He'd had a good meal with the state highway patrolman, but had regurgitated much of it to turn the man, and had not satisfied his munchies by draining the trucker, as was the original plan. Well, yeah, if you don't like it, you can, start driving, man. I'm sick of all the belly aching, dude. Weasel continued the ongoing exchange that had started over 5 decades in the past. He wasn't sure that turning the trooper had been a good idea. The process was literally draining, and the remainder of their plan had failed. We missed out on that tractor trailer rig, too. Would have been a great place to hide out during daylight and stuff. Wanda stretched and scratched absently at her hair. Well, it's done now. Let's just move on to the next lair, after we grab a snack. Weasel shook his head. I think we need to take care of that trucker dude. He saw Daffy in all her toothy glory, and maybe Raisin leering from the side door. They'll have to let him go sooner or later. We left a body, so he'd get sent to jail, but no blood and nothing else ties him to a murder. Besides, he sniggered, that trooper will not keep for long. He'll wake up hungry, and with no body and other dead, while the trucker boy is on ice. The troopers will be going crazy. Scott was pretty shaken. He'd met with his defense attorney. Weird stuff going on, according to her. The officer's body had been drained of blood before it was placed in the trailer box. There had been odd bite marks on the neck, one of the arms and both legs, each along major arteries. The times did not match up from when he left the traffic stop and when he arrived with his load. He'd have had no time to do so much damage away from witnesses while leaving no forensic evidence at the patrol vehicle. It made no sense for him to take the body, especially when he had to open the truck at his destination and would have had to explain the corpse. Their visit was cut short when word of some sort of commotion among the state police arrived, and the attorney left to see what she could find. Now Scott was stuck in a segregation cell at the local county jail. Great, he said to the stainless steel combination of sink and toilet across from his steel bunk with the too thin mattress. At least I get a room to myself, what with the capital murder charge and being on a psych watch. Was so hungry. Crap. Ow. What happened to me? Those freaky hippies, did they slip me drugs? Seems like something worse. State highway patrolman. deceased partially, Andreas Truello stared down at the freshly made corpse at his feet. The one he'd made from the living body of his boss. Though he was indoors and in a basement, he knew that a long, eventful night and day had passed. Night had again arrived. He had to get outside to get away from this place. He had to hide what he'd done. He moaned as he picked up the cadaver. "Oh, Captain, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I don't understand." He placed it inside the body bag in which his own, more animated carcass had resided, then closed and sealed it. He pushed the cadaver cart inside the cold storage drawer and stalked for the exit. He met no resistance as he fled into the night. He wasn't sure where he would go. The world raced around him. Should he turn himself in to the colonel? No, he knew that he must remain free, that he must roam the night and find a safe place to stop, to think, to make decisions on what to do, how to explain, and eventually to feed. As night fell once more, the old VW microbus pulled out from the shelter of the abandoned gas station and headed back towards more settled areas. Weasel, as usual, was at the wheel. "Hey, man, I really wish we had some powers like movie vampires. Sure would be nice to be able to turn into stuff and bounce around with super strength." It was an old lament, but the unlife that animated each of the erstwhile hippies was often boring, and they tend to fill the time with the same discussions and arguments as they had since the beginning of their seemingly eternal journey. The old vamps in that cemetery said that we'd last as long as we could feed and didn't get spiked to the ground, beheaded, and or burned. We didn't really age, but we all look kinda old. Definitely not the healthy and beautiful young flower children we were that night. 1969. "No, man," Weasel shouted as they once more entered the old cemetery grounds. "We gotta get some answers. What are we gonna do with that couple we picked up at the festival? Come on, man, they're drained of blood. What should we do with their bodies?" He shuddered and assumed a lost look of confusion and misery. Daffy rubbed his shoulders. "Hey, guy, you gotta relax. We're here now, not sure why or how, but we all knew the way. Maybe it's a good place to put those two. Maybe we can add them to a fresh grave. I read somewhere that in an old murder movie mystery or detective novel." It was full-on dark, yet none of them noticed. They were able to sense their way through the graveyard. An old structure rose ahead of them, a mausoleum unusual in this area, where most graves were relatively humble affairs. As they grew closer, they saw, ranged around the structure, 3 lean, pale figures that loomed in the darkness. One of them was as tall as Weasel and even more cadaverous. They were not frightening, but rather familiar. Gaping, fang-filled grins leered towards the 4 travelers as they drew to a halt and faced the beings that now clearly remembered from 2 nights hence. "Greetings, young ones. You appear troubled, but perhaps memories now return?" the tall one asked. The newly made vampires nodded in unison. "Good. Then perhaps you understand that you are no longer what you were. No longer truly alive. Yet you are animated and self-aware. You will find that hunting soon becomes less disturbing. It is simply a fact of our existence. You are the first we've turned in our long existence. Our little cabal has been active since the war to end all wars still raged. Apparently it did not end wars, since the cemetery collected many new bodies with little flags beside the markers a couple of decades later, then more a few years later, and recently a smattering of young people who, still in the area, were sent away to the latest political conflagration. We have grown old, and prey has grown scarce. While we do not age as do the living, we do collect, wear, with similar results, and lean times aggravate the process. As you can see, we all appear old, but each of us was laid to rest here in our 20s. I'm sure you have many questions. Present day. Andreas lurched up the stairs towards his second-floor apartment home. He knew that something profound had happened to him, and he had since done something profoundly wrong. Yet he needed to seek shelter. It would be daylight before too long, and he felt tired and experienced a strong urge to seek shelter, darkness. Fortunately, he lived alone now that he was divorced for the third time, so there was no one at home who would want an explanation for the gore and crud on his uniform that was normally so crisp and clean, even at the end of a shift. Once inside, he stripped off his clothing and washed off the grime. He fell onto his bed and was instantly asleep. He awakened to searing hot pain on his upper leg and foot. He sat up and looked down to see that the spots of morning sunlight that penetrated through his window shades illuminated the area where his now burned appendages had rested before he was yanked from slumber by pain. There were indeed 2 circular, blistered burns, one on his lower thigh and the other on the top of his foot, just below the base of his toe. I won't be able to wear my work boots with that, he thought vaguely. He realized he was uncomfortably warm and felt a feverish, lethargic sensation like the flu. It took a moment, but he realized that the filtered sunlight that dimly lit his bedroom was the cause. He rose and made his way into the bathroom. It had no window. He closed the door, pushed the little rug from the front of the toilet into the space below the door, then clambered into the tub, and was soon once more deep in a death-like coma. His last thought was, when I awaken, I'll have to call in sick at work. Oh, wait, they know I'm not sick, I'm dead. How do I call that in? Jojo placed his purchases from the roadside liquor store on the front seat of his tricked-out car. His plan to party with his latest paramour, Sonia, tonight. She was able to find a sitter at the last moment. He wasn't sure he wanted to take on a chick with 2 kids, but maybe they could have some fun for a while. He fiddled with his vape device and added some of his other acquisitions from earlier that night. He wanted to be ready to get her in the mood as soon as he arrived. I loved the smell of that stuff. A female voice purred from outside his driver's side window. It was a creaky, dry voice that sounded thirsty and full of need. He looked up but only saw gloom and the outline of an old van beside the store wall, over in the deeper shadows cast by the piss-yellow lights on the building and parking lot lamppost. He shrugged it off as nervous anticipation and went back to fixing up his party favors for the night. I wonder if he's gonna hug it all. A nasally male voice, equally creaky and dissected, inquired from behind his passenger side window. He looked that way, but condensation had gathered over the window, over all of the windows, very rapidly. In front and back windows fogged over as he watched, and grew afraid. Hey man, get away from my ride, he shouted to hopefully startle the intruders and make them leave. He heard cackling laughter in response. This dude is unfriendly man. Don't seem like the type to share his toys, Weasel proclaimed. Jojo hit the switch for the windshield wipers. They scraped the fog from the front of him, and he saw pale, grayish faces with blazing eyes and sunken sockets, leering at him with too many teeth. He looked over his shoulder. He couldn't see. It would be deadly to back out towards the highway blindly. He decided that maybe these were just druggies trying to mess with him, or maybe out of their minds. Maybe I can bluff them, he thought, and opened his car door. Mr. Wilson, though the judge lowered your bail with the expulsory information we found, you are still the primary suspect and will have to wear a monitoring device. The ridiculously hot attorney with the heart-shaped face and magnificent hair informed him, I'm not allowed to discuss it yet, but there is some new information from that disturbance at the state police office. All I can say is that it will work in your favor. Odd things happening. Oh, you'll be able to work, but you'll have to contact the deputy who is monitoring you and give him or her your routes each day. Scott shook his head. I don't imagine I'll have a job when I get out of here. My boss is a pretty clean operator. Won't want to be associated with the news stories. Ms. Lefevre smiled. Oh, I think he'll be understanding. Besides the media, even social media isn't in on this just yet. Management at my firm has assured me that he's on board for now. So get with the deputy and then get back to work. You have a family to support. 1969. So, Turnus, you drank our blood and then vomited most of it back into our mouths? Daffy asked incredulously. Had she not already had the pallor of the undead, she would have paled in horror at the thought of anyone, but most especially these creepy kind of dead people, vomiting blood into her mouth. Yet somehow her gorge did not rise. No waves of nausea plagued her, only disgusted thoughts. It's really that simple? Just drain a body and then puke most of the blood back in? No spells or nothing? Raisin had finally found a situation that sparked his interest and what little energy he possessed. The cadaverous one, who had given his name as Deason Carter, nodded. He wore a mew of distaste for the crude, though admittedly accurate description rendered by the young man with the odd mark on his face that looked like a dried grape. A raisin. That's it. No magical phrases or rituals. Simply draining the body, and before it cools, regurgitating blood into it until you've restored at least half. It only works when 2 or more vampires take on the task. Something about the mixing of blood. It must reside in our bodies for long enough to absorb whatever element is essential to restoring bestowing unlife. Not an endeavor to be undertaken lightly. Our cabal is fading. No one new is moving to this place, and our graveyard receives fewer visitors each year. No one has been added for some time. You will be our legacy. When we dry out and turn to dust, you will be out roving the world in our stead. Weasel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally added his own question. If you're all starving, what are we supposed to do? None of us live close by. We're on an expedition, man. So what do? Find a graveyard? Sounds kind of dead end, if you'll pardon the expression. One of the other remaining animated cadavers rolled her eyes. She'd given her name only as Wilma. Weasel had made a weak Flintstones joke that she had no way to comprehend. You have not been buried, so you're free to roam. We have attachments to the local land. We don't really know why, but our range is limited, and we are drawn back to our graves before dawn. Yet your attachment is to that machine, the van, so you're free to travel so long as you stay out of the sunlight. You won't like the effects it will have on you. The world has changed greatly since we breathed. Perhaps you will find more variety to help you endure the long road ahead, if you'll pardon the expression. Present day. Val sat at her computer. The long hours had not yet taken a toll, though she was a little tired of reading online. What her source had told her was disturbing. The body of Andreas Trujillo was missing and had been replaced by his captain. It had caused a considerable stir among the state constabulary. Fortunately for her client, it muddied the waters of his own case enough to further create doubt of his culpability. She wasn't, strictly speaking, a criminal attorney, but she wanted some experience in that area. So the partners had allowed her to take on a few pro bono cases to hone her courtroom skills and to introduce her to the local government legal establishment. She had specifically sought the Wilson case. A win would help her build her reputation. Besides, there were some odd aspects that intrigued her. Definitely not a werewolf or similar creature, she considered. Perhaps something else entirely. The medical examiner had said something about lamprey bites and giant leeches among the articles she perused about blood-draining creatures. None of those in the natural world fit, and the best candidate among cryptids was the chupacabra. Definitely not. Yet at the bottom of the article, zombies and vampires. She thought, then shook her head. Nope, pure supernatural fantasy. Sure, there were werewolves and dogmen, but really, vampires? That was a great score, man, Raisin raved. Got the guy with the good dope, the good booze, got to drive his hot rod, and got to drop it off a bridge. Like, how cool is all that, man? Wanda grinned back at him. Yeah, I was feeling really drained after we turned the trooper. Feeling much better. That vape stuff was nice. But I was happy with the Lambrusco. Feeling mellow. Weasel looked over his shoulder at the two currently satisfied passengers on the trip to nowhere. He was satisfied enough, but would have liked a greater share of blood. Still, the most vicious aspects of his hunger were sated. Hey man, remember that boatload of ganja we got off the boat at the harbor in San Fran? That was some heavy stuff, man. Plus we ate until we were full as ticks. Oh man, way back in 1972. We were still just baby vamps, man. Kinda wish time would, fly. He sunk into his depressed reveries as Daffy reached over and took his hand. I do remember that. The harbor in San Francisco. Nice place. Too bad we had to sink that sweet boat. But there was just too much blood left over with 6 bodies. Not even the 4 of us with munchies could hold it all. Wish we had some extra tonight. I'm still a little peckish. That boat would have been a fun place to live. Maybe go more places. But the van always seems to call us, like their graves did the old cabal. Maybe we could steal a ferry. Weasel looked doubtful. Too much sunlight on a boat for my taste. Besides, we've been all over the good old USA Canada, and Mexico. We've had blood from every kind of person there is. That boat had enough cash on it to get the van working, and the things we've found since..." He trailed off, but picked up the thread after a moment's musing. "Seems like we always end up back in the van. Always taking a long trip. Like we got stuck doing what we're doing when we returned. It ain't a graveyard or a grave, but it sure gets to be just as monotonous." Wanda grimaced. "I remember the time I got stuck sunbathing. 1976? During the bicentennial. We watched a fireworks show in D.C., got hold of those disco freaks and jacked up on the coke they'd used. Made the show intense, but it was hard to sleep when morning approached. We barely made it back to the van and covered the windows. We were out there at Hainesport. I missed a section on the back window and woke up with my legs frying. Man, that hurt. Ugly scars, but not like anyone wants to check out my gams these days." "Now who's complaining?" Rayson rejoined. "We've done some cool stuff, seen lots of shows and concerts, used all kinds of goodies, come up with games to play when we hunt. We've had a great life, or death, or undeath. Unlive? Whatever, dude. Beats getting old and falling apart. We're just kind of rust a little, get gray, droopy skin, and really bad sunburns." The last got a laugh, even from Wanda, and returned the mood from maudlin to nostalgic. Trio rose around the same time as the moon. He was hungry. Not insanely so, as when he'd first awakened, but definitely in need of sustenance. He realized that by now. The others would have found Captain Biles' body and noticed that he was gone. His senses had become clear after he'd rested, and it had started to dawn on him that he had died in that old hippie van. Now he craved blood to stay alive, though he didn't really breathe and he had no pulse. He saw that the blistered burns had healed but left scars. "Now I know what I am. I've seen the movies. Vampire. Wonder what cool powers I have. Maybe I have to build up to them. Until then, where can I find a body no one will miss?" He dressed in dark clothing and made his way out into the night. He knew right where to go. The overpass for the interstate lay near his home. He knew that drunks and drug addicts lived there. There were even some worn-out street hookers who plied their trade among the other junkies. When he hadn't caught his limit of tickets, he could always count on the overpass to deliver an intoxicated subject, to close out the shift with an easy arrest. This would be a snap, and no one will look for these derelicts. He laughed internally. This undead business might have upsides. The smell hit him first. He'd always noticed it, but now the intensity was overwhelming. He also smelled blood, though. Much of it was tainted, but still tantalized his senses. The overpass was popular because it was long and spanned a train track. There were railroad turnabouts on either end, but they were sparsely traveled. The fences that separated the rail beds from the railroads were breached long ago, and the railway company had ceased to try and keep them repaired. The area was overgrown with weeds and brush and acted, in part as a refuge dump and in part as storage for the area's unfortunates who had nowhere else to put their meager belongings. It was usually spooky at night, though now he could sense his way. He had built-in night vision. He saw which piles out among the weeds were sleeping people and which were just trash. He cackled to himself. They're all trash piles. Then he smelled her. One of the piles was a woman. She had fresh blood seeping from. Oh, his smile grew more wicked, and he gnashed his newly sharpened teeth. He wondered for a moment if he could still... yes. He felt the stirring in his groin in anticipation. Old Andy, the lady killer, has still got it, he crowed to himself. Now she's gonna get it. There was no struggle. The woman was already deep in the arms of Sultan Opioid, flying through tales of Arabian Nights in her dreams. She felt strong hands grip her, and she hadn't been ready for that. Maybe I made a deal. She felt a sting on the inside of her thigh at the femoral artery. And then bliss, followed by waves of weakness as her life drained from her. Trujillo arose from his victim in triumph, flush with blood and the feeling of manhood that only a depraved former soul could feel. He'd already decided how to dispose of the body. He'd worked pedestrian train collisions, and there was rarely much evidence left at the scene. Then a new type of euphoria intruded. What taint had been in her blood? Scott left his boss's office and stalked out towards his newly assigned truck. It was a connected panel style for local hauling, rather than a big rig tractor trailer. Miss Lefevre had been right about him keeping his job, but he was restricted to local deliveries. It didn't pay as well, and he hated city driving. Still, he had to work to keep his family solvent and supplied. He was still bothered by what had happened and puzzled as well. There was a dead state police officer missing and another body in cold storage. He was glad that the jerk who'd written the chicken scratch ticket was now missing. That meant if the DA tried to press the case around him, there'd be less evidence. Still, it was freaky. Ms. Lefevre had told him to take care in case the weirdos in the van showed up again. They might try to find him. Odd the deputy who monitored his whereabouts hadn't mentioned any threats. Maybe he hadn't cared. He looked bored when he delivered the instructions on the ankle monitor. He sighed and climbed into the cab of his newly assigned truck. Couldn't call the truck new, though. Everything seemed to work, except the heater, he realized as his breath huffed out a little steam. As long as the GPS tracker works. I don't want to set off any alarms. I'm sure those hippie freaks have left the area. Maybe moved on down the road. Val scanned the news and what law enforcement reports she could access. Sheriff Cloud had helped with a contact at the state police office. She knew that investigators had looked for Trujillo at his apartment. They'd tracked his electronic purchases until the count was flagged. The video feed from the exit of the county morgue had not worked. No one saw him leave or be removed. He'd simply vanished. She was now looking for missing person cases or dead bodies found along the route Scott Wilson had traveled the night Officer Trujillo was murdered. But after he was in jail, there was a fresh report of a missing man. He'd failed to show up at work at an auto parts store. The reporting investigator had done a good job and intercepted tales of a disappointed date who was upset with the missing party. It was something and nothing at the same time. He was an adult. No one had seen him since he made a purchase at a liquor store along the highway, and there was no reason to suspect foul play. He could have taken off for a new place or been passed out somewhere. She'd have to keep looking. This one was a tough nut to crack. Then the raving werewolves. That one had left plenty of evidence and a blood-soaked trail. Apparently vampires tidied up most of the blood and all but select bodies. 1985. Dallas sucks, man. When the price of oil tanked, this whole state fell apart. Look at the newspaper, dudes. All those relax watches for sale. The rich people are getting desperate, man. Weasel informed the others from his perch on the rest area picnic table. They decided that the stop would make a great hunting stand. There were several big trucks and an old camper parked on the other side. If they didn't find anything better, they'd take on a sleeping truck driver. Wanda had a great routine where she'd pose as a lot lizard. The truck would think he was going to have a little fun and chomp, slurp. It was still early, though, and passenger vehicles still stopped here by the restrooms and tables. Missing truckers would be noticed sooner, since they had schedules and people waiting for them. Random travelers, though, they might not be noticed for days, especially when their vehicles left the rest area in a reasonable amount of time. Wanda rolled her eyes. It's Rolex watches, dude. They are expensive, but the yuppies were buying them to, show off. When they started selling their pickup trucks, it's time to worry. Daffodil tittered. Hey, maybe those personal sales ads could be useful. If people are, desperate, we could call them and make deals to meet them. Like here or some other place that's public, but not. The others thought for a moment, then one by one, their faces brightened. Daffy, you are the queen vampchick of all time, Weasel pronounced. Present. Weasel drove along a dark country lane. I can't believe we almost got caught because of the want ad serial killer. We left that area just in time. Some dude copycatted us, man. Wish we could have caught him and turned him. That'd serve him right. Wanda, who had taken over the front passenger seat for a change of scenery, nodded. Yeah, so how are we going to fix that trooper's wagon without revealing vampires exist? Weasel chuckled. But child of flowers, do we really exist, or are we simply imagining that we do? He used a goofy voice and accent he'd developed for a fictional 1960s guru, something he did for amusement and to pass the endless time. Wanda favored him with a neutral look. I'm serious, man. We need to spike that butthole and let him starve. He deserves it after what he tried on Daffy and me. Daffy added from the back seat next to a seemingly passed-out raisin. He ain't joining us in the van. Of course, that's just where he died. Maybe he's attached to wherever he awakened. Ain't that what the old Cabal guys said? Trujillo listened to the television report in quiet reserve. Captain Biles' body had been released to the family, and they'd had a service. It had made the local and state news. The long line of emergency vehicles with flashing lights. The bagpipe music sounding as the reporter faded in and out with her comments. Mourners gathered today to say farewell to State Police Captain Jerome Biles today. State Police spokesperson Roberta Gonzalez informed us that the death was still under investigation and that the public information officer would not speculate about rumors of foul play. However, she confirmed that the death was in the line of duty. He switched off the set and slouched in the recliner. He had paid for 3 months' rent in the Fleabag Extended Stay Hotel that smelled of freshly cooked methamphetamine. It was as close to the county morgue as he could get. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to linger in the area. He knew that people would look for him in his apartment. They likely already had. They'd tracked his electronic purchases, so he had taken some cash he had stashed and all that he could withdraw from ATMs near his apartment until his account was flagged. He'd been careful to cover his face so that the cameras didn't catch him. This place took hard currency and did not ask for proof of identity, so it was as off the grid as he could find for the moment. He would need to find someplace more permanent. Perhaps he'd have to start feeding on people with more resources to steal after they no longer needed them. He had to find a way to shelter during sunlight hours. Maybe I could find a way to get into the ceiling area of the morgue. Miss Lefevre, it would be best if you simply worked with the prosecutor's office. We'll handle the investigative end of things, Captain Vu assured her. I'm up to my neck in alligators, trying to sort out the Captain Biles' former team, and my investigators are up there, trying to resolve the murder of 2 of our officers. So I don't have any information on what direction the prosecutor will take with your client. So what is it that you want? Val sat quietly for a moment, a technique she'd learned from Uncle Earl. If the other party had more to say, they'd speak. In the meantime, she could collect her own thoughts. Captain Vu gave in first. Look, I've shared everything we can. There are some weird aspects to the cases. Still no signs of Truello. I'll have to tell you that much. Like his dead body just got up and walked away. The coroner claims that he must have been at least partially alive, maybe in a deep coma, and that they somehow got it wrong. Maybe a third party is involved. Maybe you should talk with him. Val smiled. She knew when it was time to move on before she burned any bridges. Thank you, Captain. I only want to gain some perspective. I wouldn't want to compromise your investigation. I know that I'm skirting the edges of protocol even by visiting you. Still, it's an odd case on my end as well, and you were not directly involved, so the conversation should be okay on the legal side. I appreciate your time. I have the contact information for the coroner, but perhaps you'd assist me with scheduling a meeting so I don't accidentally mess up your end of the work. The good captain did indeed help her, and now she stood in the meat locker with the county coroner. I'm sorry for the location, Ms. Lefevre, Val supplied. It's no problem. I took a tour when I was in law school, part of our learning experience. Dr. Gottlieb nodded. Oh, we've been particularly busy over the past few weeks. Several of our homeless community have fallen victim to accidents, 2 or 3 of them a week. So the bodies are, if you'll pardon the expression, piling up. He walked over towards the examination table on which rested a sheet-covered cadaver. I should probably keep this quiet, but it's freakish and strange to the degree that it had me, and the investigator stumped. He rolled back the sheet to reveal a body that had been crushed by something large. Notice anything? Val did, immediately based on her experience with werewolf mangled corpses. Where's the blood? Have you cleaned the person? The doctor shook his head. Came in this way, just like the others. Only small traces of blood and still present. The bodies have all been mangled in some way by trains, big trucks, trash compactors, a few from long drops, yet no real messes, just meat. Any thoughts? Val pretended to seriously consider the question. Any other marks on them that would indicate that something killed them before they were mutilated? Dr. Gottlieb smiled. Only on 2. The rest were too damaged to confirm. Odd bites like a lamprey, and each centered over a major artery, much like those on Truello's body. Val shrugged. Vampire? Chupacabra? Batman? The smile on the doctor's face disappeared. Ma'am, your question was a good one. Yet now you want to joke. These people are dead. It's a serious matter. I'm sorry, Doctor. I do take it seriously. I, of course, don't mean real monsters, but maybe a person suffering from psychosis? Val did her best to placate the man, yet she still wanted to set his mental wheels turning in the right direction. She really needed to develop contacts in the medical world. Maybe they could even find a cure for Uncle Earl. The coroner calmed. It was easy in the presence of an exceptionally attractive woman, who was much younger than he. Yes, the investigators are exploring that angle. Lots of variables. At least the city has sent out more social workers, and the homeless crowd are crowding into shelters for protection. Oh, and between us, the lead investigator has closely been watching your client. He hasn't been near any of the sites from which the victims have disappeared or been found, other than to drive over some of the bridges. Scott had started to grow accustomed to the shorter routes and city traffic. He never liked it, but his wife did. No more days away from home, at least for the moment. There was another hearing in the next 2 weeks. Ms. Lefevre had said she was going to request a dismissal. The body was missing after the police claimed it. There was no evidence to link him to the actual murder, if a murder even occurred, other than the body. There was no evidence that showed that he'd placed the body in the truck. The prosecutor had too little to use. It was unlikely he would indict at this time. Besides, his murder caseload was likely to grow when they found out what was happening with the latest spat of bloodless corpses. It was dark before he reached the lot. Not unusual this time of year. He was looking forward to getting home to his wife and kiddos. Oh, crap, he thought as his adrenaline spiked and the thrill in his chest alerted him. The hippie van at that cross street. He slowed for a moment. Perhaps that was mistaken. Nope, that's them, he shouted. He sped ahead as the old vehicle pulled in behind him. See, man, like I told you would be able to find him. Now we can feed and get some revenge for him messing with us and our pal, Weasel stated triumphantly. Just took some patience and waiting on him to show his face in the window. He eased the van close up behind the truck and stayed out of view of the driver's mirrors. Daffodil, restored to her normal perch on the front passenger seat, leaned forward in anticipation. Yeah, no games this time. We just take him, right? She was greeted with a chorus of, yeah, man. About then, the truck driver slammed on his brakes. Even Weasel's practiced reflexes couldn't react in time. They were only going about 45 miles per hour when the front bumper contacted the bumper of the truck, right at the hitch assembly. Weasel cursed and the others joined in with individual expletives that expressed his or her unhappiness with the events. There were no seatbelts in the van, but there wasn't much damage a person could do to a set of animated corpses. The truck started to back, to push them backwards with it. Weasel got the van to start, but when he slammed the transmission into first gear, all he managed to do was spin and start to melt the tires and grind the transmission. He quickly clutched and shifted into neutral to save the transmission and engine. Eventually, amidst the shouts and cursings of his crew, the backwards journey stopped. The big truck's driver shifted gears and began to pull forward once more. It pulled ahead as Weasel listened to the rattle of the power training the van. Raisin shouted from the back seat, Hey man, what are you doing? Like, chase him, dude. Weasel looked over his shoulder. I gotta make sure the van ain't damaged. If you want to take over driving, be my guest. Daffodil placed her hand on his shoulders. Do whatever you do, Weez. That just startled us a little. Scott made the next turn and sped up. He almost hoped there'd be a city cop to stop him. He could use some help. He slowed his breathing and calmed himself. Have to get back to the lot. Stan will be there and maybe some of the other guys. I have to report this. As usual, the sound of his own voice calmed him, and he took his own advice, all the while constantly checking his mirrors. When he arrived, he spoke to his boss, Stan, and they inspected the back of the truck together. Not much damage, Scott. A few scrapes on the bumper, maybe a new dent. Paint missing on the edge of the loading platform. We'll call the state police, but we report this immediately. Maybe you should call into the monitoring office at the sheriff's office. There was no arrest this time. Scott had a better description of the van, though he still had been unable to see through the darkened glass. He went ahead and described the two people who had looked at him at the traffic light just before dawn after their first encounter, as though he'd spotted them in this one. He noticed that the license plate were new and from Ohio, though he hadn't been able to see any of the numbers. He was told to report to the local state police station the next day and speak with Captain Vu, who now supervised the station. He had to leave a voice message for the 24/7 monitors at the sheriff's office. No one answered. So quotes this Raven. 2 more parts to this chapter. Let's see. So next week we should be done with this. Nice little crossover with Val there. As promised by Bear himself. Have a lovely day, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.